Thank you to all you brave souls for getting up so early to join us. We appreciate it very much. I'm Tara Junta. I'm a partner in the law firm of Paul Hastings. Also have the honor of being legal counsel to PTC. So I think this is my 25th year at PTC. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. With me today are Lynn Smullen from Verizon and Amy Marks from Excite Modular. And the topic, yay.
We had to get up very early.
Really?
By the way,
really?
we should be thanking you for joining us.
And I think some people here may be our advanced team, but that's good. So the topic today is the Business Roundtable's restatement of the purpose of a corporation and ESG. And it's really important for all of us, not only because of the underlying issues that are being addressed in ESG, but because it has become really a corporate imperative. And it's something that these women leaders, executives, are dealing with daily and really have their own personal and professional commitment as well as those of their companies. So it's very important. Before we turn and have a conversation, I thought I would take a few minutes, and just in case some folks may not be fully versed in terms of the Business Roundtable statement and kind of where we are with ESG. So if you give me just a moment, should be there. So the Business Roundtable issues its statement of the purpose of a corporation periodically, and over the past 3 decades at least, the purpose of the corporation has always been to operate in the best interest of shareholders. In August, it reissued its purpose statement and broadened that to all stakeholders, certainly includes shareholders, but really is focused, as it said, to promote an economy that serves all Americans. So it went from the primacy of shareholders, kind of almost to the exclusion, to all stakeholders. So they had about 170 CEOs, I believe is the number, a high number of CEOs that endorsed the statement. It took several years, a number of years of internal review and discussion before they, not surprisingly, issued the statement. But if you look at some of the statements that the leaders made, they're really focusing on the fundamental role that corporations play in their communities, with their employees, their suppliers, and really how corporations should be thinking about those constituencies when they're talking about long-term value and what does that look like, and really what should they all be focusing on. It's not just short-term returns. It's a much broader, nuanced conversation. So to flesh it out a little bit, they said the BRT purpose statement focuses on delivering value to customers, investing in employees, including foster diversity and inclusion, dignity and respect, dealing fairly and ethically with suppliers, supporting the communities in which they work. And if you notice, I just excerpted some of the quotes, respect the people in the communities, and protect the environment by embracing sustainable practices across our businesses, and of course, generating long-term value for shareholders. So that was a really interesting development, but it came after a number of years, and really, from a lawyer's standpoint, is really the culmination of what we've been seeing over the last number of years in the area of ESG. So ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is a way of looking at what some view as kind of the soft metrics, not hard financial metrics, soft metrics that a corporation should be focused on. It came out of about 2004, Kofi Annan from the UN reached out to the investing community and said, look, in order to address the global challenges that we've got, income inequality, health, economic disadvantagement, education, we really need your buy-in. We need you to come. And he wrote letters to about 50 of the largest investors and investing institutions. That then led to a series of reports that looked at ESG and really found that there was a correlation between ESG and investing in ESG and corporate performance. Not surprisingly, it took a number of years for then you being able to see the metrics or have the metrics to prove out that case. And so you saw in around 2013, 14, where studies were coming out, reports were coming out that validated the belief that really investing in ESG redounds to the bottom line benefit of corporations. What that does is it then puts on boards and senior management a more nuanced, perhaps, understanding of what meeting your fiduciary obligation is. Because if you're not paying attention to metrics that affect bottom line performance of the company, you have a problem. So then you have the BRT statement, the Business Roundtable statement that came out in August, and you see where kind of, at least corporate America has come around and said, by the way, as we were talking about, probably behind companies and governments outside of the US, but have come around more to a broader understanding, deeper understanding of what that means. I was just showing here a couple of examples, and then we're going to turn to the panelists, of companies and investors that have, and there are now, of course, impact investors surfacing. Most of the investing community have ESG funds, have a gloss or a focus through which, a lens through which they look at their investments that is ESG focused. Intel, it's interesting, as just a company in our sector, really about 20 years ago looked at ESG as really a competitive differentiator for them and looked and said, okay, what are we going to do to really understand how these ESG factors are affecting our business and what can we do to make a positive impact. Since 2012, they've invested more than $200 million. They focused on energy conservation, and we're going to talk about that too. Like, what does it mean for your company? It's a big, huge topic and an umbrella. How do you look at it? They looked at it from an energy conservation perspective, and again, bottom line result is they had energy savings of more than 4 billion kilowatt hours, a cost savings of approximately 500 million through the end of 2018. Pretty impactful, right? So they're also one of the first companies to publicly disclose diversity numbers and again, focus around their inclusion strategies. And again, a business imperative, how are they going to attract and retain top talent, right? Again, there's a business correlation between ESG and the company. And so in 2015, they set the goal of full representation of women and underrepresented minorities in the US workforce by 2020 and beat that 2 years early than their goal. So something, just an example. There are a number, I'm sure, and we have a couple of folks here who are going to talk about theirs. And this is just Director of Corporate Responsibility for Intel saying publicly reporting our goals and performance has improved accountability and allowed us to share best practices and insights with others. So trying to make a broader industry impact. And they found that over time, their ability to continue to drive greater efficiency and be transparent, transparency is an interesting and important topic, has only increased in importance as customers and investors increase their own focus on sustainability, performance, and goals. And then just wanted to flip on the investor side, BlackRock, their sustainability is BlackRock's new standard for investing, noting that the increasing shift by clients to focus on impact of sustainability on their portfolios is driven by an increased understanding of how sustainability-related factors can affect economic growth, asset values, and financial markets as a whole. So, it's really, it has gained a lot of momentum, and it's something that all companies and all industries should be focused on. So, there's more about their quotes, and they sent letters to executives. But so I guess I'd like, and by the way, we're going to start the conversation, but as you have questions, please feel welcome to raise your hands. The lights are somewhat not as bright as yesterday, so it's easier to see you. Let me start though, and Lynn, if I can start with you, and just kind of tell us a little bit about Verizon's journey in the ESG space and kind of where you are today.
Fantastic. Thank you. First, thank you, Tara, and thank you for having me here. And thank you to everyone for coming out so early. We're excited to have you here. Verizon has had a long-standing history and commitment to social good and commitment to doing well and doing good to our communities, to our shareholders, to our customers, to our stakeholders. So for us, ESG has been something part of our DNA for many years, as evidenced by some of our work that we do in the community. However, of recent, in 2019, we recently announced, as part of an initiative engaging with BSR, an outside consulting firm, two things: our purpose and a formal structure around ESG and what that means to us in terms of priorities and goals, but tracking and measuring our success towards achieving those goals. We worked with BSR, and one of the things we first came up with was that purpose, because as Larry Fink at BlackRock said, right, it's profits with a purpose. It's no longer acceptable for us to be corporations operating solely with a focus on profitability only and not looking at the broader social good, both globally, but really in the local communities we share or that we support and serve. And to that end, BSR helped us structure a whole organization, but also a plan, really, around those priority objectives that are, for us, are meaningful, they're material to our business, and they're impactful to the communities we serve. We also went a step further and integrated from the UN, the Sustainability Development Goals, and we've integrated 3 of those within our corporate focus going forward. And those 3 are really exciting for us. And one thing before I go into that, it's really worth noting that our industry is so unique for what we do in ICT, because inherent in what we do and the solutions we provide, they drive benefit to society globally. The networks and the solutions and the innovation that we are putting forth provide better healthcare, greener footprints, improve education, and uplift society globally. There are very few industries like ours who can lay that claim. So we should all be very proud to be part of it and to be stewards of our future. But back to Verizon. So Verizon, as part of our journey though, we engaged BSR and we really focused in on 3 UN Sustainability Development Goals. The first is really around making sure our young people have the skills needed for good jobs going forward, and that includes making sure they have access to technology and things that they'll need for those jobs. The second is around creating sustainable economic environments that are environmentally friendly, and then the third is around driving climate change. We've had some exciting initiatives and accomplishments really in the last few years that I'll mention. The first is last year, we were the first in the US telecoms industry to put forth $1 billion green bond fund, which was unheard of in the US. Very exciting for us. It was oversubscribed 6 times over. That tells you the demand is there in the investor community, where they're looking for more than just profits. They're looking for corporations who are committed to improving the lives of those in their community and improving sustainability for us as humanity going forward. Second exciting objective is we've said by 2035 we will be carbon neutral. It's very exciting. Third is we've committed to plant over 2 million trees by 2030. And the fourth is really exciting. We have stood up a program called the Verizon Innovation Learning Initiative, where we are outreaching into our own communities to the high-risk middle school groups to give them access to internet and access to technology that they otherwise wouldn't have. And that ties right back to achieving that goal to uplifting the societies that we serve and really the local communities that we serve.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. Amy, Amy, In your world with smaller, more mid-sized companies, kind of how are you seeing ESG play out, or are you seeing it play out in terms of an area of discussion or consideration?
So I always like to describe what I do for a living. I have a consulting business where we enable prefabrication in large-scale projects. And then I work with some of the guys you've actually talked about today on how to get more productive on their spend for big construction projects. But I mostly in this industry work in the small space of like cable landing stations and bringing the internet to underserved markets and small edge data centers. I would say on this side of the business, I rarely run into some of the things we're talking about with ESG. I mean, we might hear about it at the corporate level, but there are so many small companies that are working in the supply chain. I can say that I've rarely been asked if I'm a certified woman-owned business and how that might tie into their ESG efforts for their diversity and inclusion program. Or many companies don't even have a supply chain diversity program. So even Facebook just started one in 2016. So we think of them as one of the largest in the industry, but they're really newbies when it comes to supply chain diversity. So it doesn't really come into play so often for us. I mean, in my consulting business, which again we work globally, prefabrication in very large-scale capital expenditures, one of the reasons that people have moved towards that in places like Singapore and the government has required it, and places like the UK and Australia and Beijing, is because we actually are a more acceptable and socially acceptable way to build. So they're looking at getting people off of job sites, dirty, unsafe job sites, and putting them into factories where it's more socially responsible for, they have lunchrooms and they have clean facilities, and we can have women co-locate their daycare within the prefabrication facilities for these constructed elements. So, and also, we've been talking about carbon footprint outside of the US with many of these large construction companies and large end users for a long time. I think in the US, we're just coming around to the discussion about carbon footprint, so that's fairly new for them. But I will say, I know I work for the government of Singapore as their international expert on prefabrication, and we've been on a journey there for I think now almost 8 years, where they spent 550 million Sing just on productivity initiatives in their construction area to try to create safer, more socially acceptable ways to build that are sustainable and actually give skills to younger people that can actually step into a factory environment and do a small portion of a big construction project as opposed to having to be a master builder and work out on the job site. Mm-hmm. I will say even globally, I'm sometimes astounded. I'll go to places. I was just in Thailand a couple years ago running a very large construction conference on prefabrication, and I have to walk by job sites for large projects and see older women barefoot in hats tying rebar. And then at the same time, I sit with big companies and they say, we just don't have the money to do factories, to build housing and have people working in these factories. And for me, it's heartbreaking because we do need to have companies like Verizon make that investment so that we can have people in a safer, more socially acceptable environment and create jobs for them and really give them skill set and producing their own housing and producing their own internet site, producing anything that really is driving their communities instead of just putting a bunch of dirty construction sites out there with, again, younger people and grandmas, that are ill-equipped with the skill set.
But is that a lack of awareness, do you think, or a lack of understanding or accepting the business case of the correlation between ESG and performance?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Intel. So Melvin Greer is a friend of mine who runs AI at Intel, and he happens to be African American. And we've had the conversation that every time they do AI, in the beginning when they would put together a team to work on AI, I'm going to paraphrase, he would say it much nicer than I'm going to say it. But they would have problems with the AI being things like homophobic or misogynistic because they had a whole bunch of white men actually programming the AI.
The algorithms.
And so, and by the way, so the problem wasn't that it came out with the wrong answers. The problem is that they had to then spend more money to rework it, right? So it's like, that's what I want. I always say I'm a capitalist, not a feminist, right? So it's like, we want to not spend money twice to get a good product. I think the problem is sometimes with the big companies is that, you have all these great programs and they focus themselves a little bit internally, that we have to put a little bit more effort externally to the ecosystem of suppliers and communities. And I always say, if you don't have a woman CEO at your company, hire my company, then your women will get to see a woman CEO negotiate with your CEO, right? That's the easiest way to get them to see what people they want to be like. And especially I would say on the infrastructure side, I feel like I'm almost like a unicorn. You know, it's like they don't exist. We're just, that you don't get to see women scientists as much as we need to, or women in tech. You know, I see Amber in the back. We don't get to see women that are, you know, chief revenue officers too often out there. We need to see more women like this, and that's why things like iMasons are so important, and joining PTC so that you can actually get to, you know, work in communities that we're going to grow young women and diverse populations so that they can see people who look like them and do business with them.
Sure.
Right.
So talking, and to shift a little bit back to Verizon, because you have had, obviously it's a journey and really accelerated, it sounds like, that forward progress and journey. But we talked a little bit about culture, right? How do you, in getting there, you know, you have all the different constituencies. Do you know, how do you involve your employees in in helping to identify where you want to be focusing in terms of your issue, or even your communities? How did you
So there's some key considerations when you're rolling out ESG. And one of them is you really have to have that center point being a meaningful purpose. You have to start there. And that purpose has to represent how you and the solutions you take to market and the initiatives you take on benefit your local communities, benefit your customers, benefit your suppliers and partners, benefit your shareholders. So it is the whole community of all of those, first off. But the second is culture, right? And we've talked about this, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, which I hope everybody had some back there. It eats strategy for breakfast. So you have to make sure that the culture you have in your company to be successful prioritizes purpose first and foremost, and is surrounding that purpose. But number two, has a bias for action, for taking action. Because to Amy's point, it can't be platitudes on a piece of paper that says we will be more diverse in our supplier community. It has to be like what Verizon has done. We've committed over $5 billion every year to bringing up suppliers who are women-owned, minority-owned, diversity across the board, so that we're not just putting statements out there, we're actually delivering on it. But the final challenge really to think about is setting forth meaningful goals, right? Picking the ones that are most material to your company, tracking and your performance to it, and then evolving. And that's a critical thing we've done at Verizon. We stood up a dedicated ESG organization who sets forth not only our purpose and tracks our performance, but we also shift as the environment shift, as our shareholders shift, as our stakeholder needs shift, but also as we achieve those goals and need to keep pushing ourselves forward, making the world a better place.
Yeah. And with the BRT statement, when it was issued, I mean, have you seen any impact or ripple effects, either within your own company, but in the ecosystem and the industry?
So I think we were cheerleading it because we've already been doing it, and it was an important thing for us. If you read some of the criticisms out there, was just that it didn't have a specific set of actions tied to it. So that's going to be the challenge really for everyone who's taking this on, is setting forth metrics that you hold yourself accountable to. Because if we don't hold ourselves accountable to it, our institutional investors will, as will our customers, as will our suppliers and our partners, and they'll all vote with their feet, right? So it's going to be critical as we move forward.
And Amy, you talked a little bit about, you work with Singapore and some foreign governments in your work. You know, a lot of the push for the ESG movement has come from outside the US, right? It's come from the UN, it's come from, so what has been your experience kind of leading up to where we are today in terms of those conversations? Because you do a lot of, your projects are not in the US, they're outside. Right. What has been that experience?
I think the reason that's happened outside the US first is they just have greater constraints than we do have here in the United States. Well, in the United States, we're in Hawaii today. I forgot where I was for a minute. But, you know, they have less, they're looking to drive down the cost of energy. They're looking to use less energy. They have a lack of skill set potentially that they're trying to increase the skill set, or they have less land, or they have, you know, they have more constraints than we're used to in the United States. You know, it's funny. funny, as we're talking about this, I was thinking about a very large project I was just consulting on with a group, and I'll be honest with you, because you know I'm a straight shooter. They have a big ESG program. And I read all about it, and I think it's great, and we are working for them as a certified woman-owned business. But then I walked on the first day of the job as the consultant, and there were about 80 engineers and architects and construction managers on the project that day. And I was the only woman besides the receptionist at that entire day. And so it's one thing when you hear about, like we just said, like all these great things that people are doing, but when you walk in that room and you are the only person that looks like you, does it really mean something when I hear about like great awards and things that go on? It's like, if we're not driving it down into the culture where somebody besides, and by the way, it wasn't actually me that said something, it was one of the guys that works with me. He said, do you realize you're the only woman in this entire room besides the receptionist that we just met? And I said, wow, you know what's funny? I didn't even notice, because even for me, it's so normal to be, I'm sure like the women that are out here, sometimes we're in those situations. And we have to really look to champions of women out there, and I see it's great. We have about 50-50 in the audience, so for all those men that slept in today, you're missing out on a fantastic opportunity to meet Lynn Smullen and some other great women, honestly, and get some FaceTime with them. By the way, that's what this is about, right? So I always say we'll do better business if you just show up and start talking to the people that you want to meet. And so, but we need more champions of women out there. Last night I was at a big data center party, and I was talking with one of their VPs in EMEA, and he said, I can't tell you how many times I will send an engineer, they'll say, I need an engineer to go out and talk at a conference, and he'll send one of his women engineers, and they will call him and say, no, I need her boss. And he will say, she is the boss. She's the engineer I'm sending, put her on stage. We need more champions like that, right? When we walk in the room. Or if you're doing something that's not socially responsible for the environment, we have to start thinking about how we're using energy, what are we doing for safety? I always say the best thing about prefabrication for safety purposes, to be more responsible, is the #1 way you can make a safer construction site isn't by hard hats, isn't by staying off ladders. It's actually to remove people from the job site. Right? Put them in factories. Manufacturing is 6 times safer than construction. Why are we, as an organization that builds giant capital programs here in digital, why are we not making it a pillar that it must be prefabricated if we know that in Singapore, there were 2 companies that used to do a particular type of construction prefabrication. They then required it, and they made some incentives monetarily for you to do prefabrication. Now I think at last count, they had 18 companies that are all now certified to do that particular skill set. Why? Because they required it, they asked for it, they showed the value of that. We have to do that, really.
So that's a great point. It's that being more intentional, thoughtful and intentional on how we're doing it. And I don't know whether this is a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. How is Verizon on the BRT statement and talking about suppliers? How are you cascading that, the ESG commitment priority that's clear at Verizon? How is that getting cascaded through the supplier function?
Right, so we actually have a stated goal that by the end of 2020, 80% of our suppliers will be held to the same standards that we hold ourselves to. And we have an auditing process in place that includes remediation and collaboration. But we've actually put resources, people internally towards this, whose primary responsibility is in that ESG organization, making sure that compliance and that purposeful approach is not just with us, but it's with our partners and suppliers, because we have the influence to drive change with our size. Our institutional investors, we do, and it's the collaboration of all of us together that's going to help us drive change, like what happened with Jana and Apple, right, where they got together to put influence back on Apple to make changes in their platform and use by young people. And that came about because you had asset managers and asset sources who came together and said, this isn't enough. And the influence came there. And that's where Verizon, with its strength, we want to do that. We want to be a leader. We are a leader in that space. And in particular with supplier diversity. The other thing to note is our own company, we've lived what we've said too. So if you look at us in our push for diversity internally, our board, I'm so proud to say this, our board, it starts at the top, is half women and minorities. There are many boards in our space who do not look like that. And we will continue to push ourselves. And it's about getting the right people, but it's about getting representation from all facets of life. And we've made a conscious effort to do that top down.
So I have to jump in because I have to be a little controversial.
You always
I'm sorry,
are.
that's just who I am. You know, that's
Really?
why I'm here.
That's how we have fun.
That's why they call me. But I think we need exactly what you're talking about at Verizon, right? So you're like, we're going to hold all our suppliers to this, and we're going to make sure that they have the same metrics as us. But I want the whole organization, everyone that's out there in the ecosystem, to recognize that that's not possible right now. I'm going to tell you why. If you look at where the money is being spent, it's in capital improvements, right? It's in big projects, it's in construction, it's in laying cables, it's in doing fiber. There is not a supply chain right now that will support those metrics on diversity and inclusion. There are not enough women-owned businesses. There are not enough minority-owned businesses. They're just not there, right? So, and the reason they're not there is, yes, we first have to start with a program, but then behind that, you better start growing some companies and start making sure that you're championing them. And by the way, and if they're doing jobs and they're not doing them well enough, you better teach them and train them and bring them along, because you won't have those companies to support these initiatives because they're not there now. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Hollywood, there's a lot of talk about, we just had Netflix yesterday, right? So they have what, 47% internal women, and over half of the people on their board are women, right? A third of their board, or?
Yeah, third. Yeah.
Third of their board. Now, I don't have to tell you, you may not have heard of that company, Netflix, but they're doing okay, right? So they have like a lot of money going on right now, but they have a lot of diversity. That's the proof right there. But that has to get down to where we're going to really look at brass tacks. Right? We don't, in Hollywood, there's a big lawsuit, right? And there was a movie called This Changes Everything. And the Women's Directors Guild actually sued because they weren't hiring women directors. Now Netflix just had an article that they're hiring more women directors than anyone. So great. And FX too did a great program. But the numbers they had when they went to the EEOC for their complaint are better than the numbers we have in construction. Better. I wish those were our numbers. So if we're expecting that there'll be companies to service you in the places we spend the most money, we have to start now.
Well, and I would actually challenge it further. We have to start earlier in the process. We start when they're children. We start to open them and open their minds to technology, to put tools out there to make them not only have access to it, but attract them to it all the way through to where they're skilled and have the right skills for jobs.
Right.
Like, we have to start much earlier than once everybody's entered the workforce because of the very problem. We don't have women dominating engineering, construction, technology areas. We have so much more work to do, but that's what we're charged to do.
Right, and I think if we don't recognize that there's a gap there,
For
right?
sure.
And the gap really is helped by people on the day-to-day basis. It's the guy that says, why are there 80 men in this room and only one woman in the room? We need to fix that, right? So it won't ever be just from the top. We have to have, like you said, it's got to come up from culture, right?
Right. Questions? Yes, Joe?
So I'm not sure actually who this is for. It might be for you, Tara, or Trisha, or Charisse, or Lynn, or Amy. But it has to do with a fundamental question around the executive team's fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, okay, not to stakeholders, but the shareholders. So on the one hand, to take a simple case, if someone goes to renewable energy and saves 50% of their fuel bill, that's great, okay? But to put it a different way, let's take the 2 million trees as an example. Is there a risk, because the Business Roundtable doesn't run the legal system, right? So is there a risk that a shareholder could sue the company and say, what are you doing with my equity funding that I gave you? You know, why aren't you using it to grow revenues, build new markets, et cetera? So when it's aligned, it's great, but what are the legal implications when it's not?
So investors do that all the time, right? Investors, and as a matter of fact, the impact investors, if you look at the board diversity issue, women on boards issue, has been heavily pushed more effectively by the investor community who's demanded it of companies, right? Who they've approached them and said, and it's not just on board diversity, they may be on environmental, right? But they're going to the companies and they're saying, you know, we hold X amount of your stock, we want to know what you're doing here. Now, I think from a legal standpoint, I think the key is really going to be in how that company approaches assessing and evaluating its ESG profile. So for instance, how do they do a risk assessment? Companies do this in all different issues and risk areas, right? Whether it's what I do, bribery, corruption, fraud, whether it's environmental, whether it's HR. How are you assessing what your ESG profile is? How transparent are you as to what your investment profile is as a company? Where and why are you focused on those areas? What are you doing to achieve those areas, and why do you think that's in the best interest of the company, including the shareholders, right? I think there's a shift, really, and the Business Roundtable statement reflects that, which is a articulation, and a lot of companies, when it came out, said, look, we do this anyway. We've always thought in terms of our long-term value and our long-term sustainability, not just short-term results. But I think it's put more of a focus on what does that look like and what does that mean. And I think transparency goes a long way to protecting a company. Companies are sued all the time for decisions they make, and so it's not to say that you're not going to get a lawsuit. But I think how the companies approach it, how transparent they are in their assessment and how they measure it and why they're making the decisions is going to go a long way to insulating or mitigating, I should say, that risk. And I don't know, in the conversations at Verizon, that's, I would have thought, a normal conversation to have, which is, how are we going to do this and what does it look like for us and why?
Right, I mean, the thing to look at there is this is around taking a much longer term view about the importance of social good and sustainability. And it inherently conflicts with short-term results driven, right? So we've all been short-term results driven, hitting EBITDA targets, hitting revenue targets, and then all of a sudden there's a change. But part of that is looking looking behind the curtain and figuring out what's driving that change. And it's the institutional investors and the amount of money, in many ways, that's sitting at risk without having a good plan for how to deal with those risks long term, environmental, social, because we know that companies who address those in a meaningful way are far more better performing than those who don't in their space. So part of it is also the changing view of the institutional investor that I would imagine we'll see a lot less complaints around planting, the trees we do, as an example, because we tie it back to the benefit to the business, the benefit to the shareholder, the benefit to the customer, the benefit to our stakeholders overall.
Let me push back for a minute, though. I think, if you're, again, we're talking about big spends in my side of the business on any kind of infrastructure improvements and capital improvements, right? So you're talking about lots and lots of money. It's a very project-centric process, right? What I mean by that is people don't care if you're going to spend more money on this one fiber project to learn about how to do it better the next time. And that they're not going to allocate some R&D, particularly in the construction business. Those words don't actually exist, R&D in construction. We're second to dead last in spend on digital technology in construction, I think behind agriculture, or right ahead of agriculture and hunting, which I challenge. But anyway, I think we're last. But the question is, if you have a very project-centric industry, where it's all about first cost, and getting the best price for your capital improvement, and you're now going to Joe's point, spend more money on this project, more shareholder money than you need to, because you could have done it for less, but you have no learning out of getting it done for less. Where are you going to end up on? Are we going to put the money and allocate some funds to start learning and growing and getting better and improving? How do you do that if at the same time you're supposed to be building for the lowest cost price and for the schedule? That those are two conflicting things, right? By the way, if you look at when you implement new technology in anything, right, any kind of change, you don't start out right away being better at what you've replaced, right? So I'll put it in the easiest possible, right? Impossible. So that's what we're talking about. Like let's take it to a factory level. You get a piece of equipment for the first time, you take it out into the factory floor. Let's say it's a welding robot. The welders sit there and laugh at you because they can weld things quicker than you actually even like trying to figure out how the software works, right? And they're like, this will never replace my job because these guys can't even make this thing weld one weld, let alone like everything I do in a day. However, so we actually get worse when we implement something new, right? And then to get transformational change, we have to keep doing it until we get better and better and better. And then those welders recognize, wow, that machine can actually do far more than I can, you know, in an amount of time. But it doesn't start that way. So who takes that risk in the dip down for those shareholders? Are you going to pay for that learning? Are you okay paying for that on your project, or how about his project?
Well,
should I pay for it on yours?
But let's talk about the Intel, right? Yeah, they had to put in the 200 million to get the 500 million back.
And by the way, they've been big advocates of prefabrication for that purpose. I will say, like, of all the big companies that are out there, they recognize they're building giant facilities and they can't do it with the current world's skill set that's out there. So they're one of the good guys, right? We hear about them, but they're not all the projects, right? So you still have stick-built projects all over this world for giant hyperscale data centers that are being built stick by stick, right? Like, that makes no sense. Makes no sense. And we don't put the innovation, the learning, the money that it takes to get good at something to look at it for the next project. Because as project managers, think about, I think in ESG, one of the things we have to think about is incentives for employees to do it, right? So it's like every project manager I know is incentivized on keeping their project, what, on time and on budget, right? How do you do that if you're spending on learning? Why are we giving them permission to learn, permission to fail, permission to have R&D? If we don't
Right,
do
but you're
that,
talking about culture.
I'm talking, but I'm also talking about shareholders, right? Like, who makes the decision that I'm going to spend the money to learn on this job now, this giant capital project, because it's going to be good for the next 10 projects for transformational change?
Yeah, but that's the job of the board and management.
Right.
Yeah,
Right?
I would say, but you have to remember, who's really interacting on a daily basis from the board on these projects going, are you on budget? No, spend $20 million more to learn that. They're not there.
But here's where the difference happens, is you have Larry Fink at BlackRock who said, we will hold the board accountable. We will haul people in from management with the board to answer to our questions specifically about achievement of those goals. He's right on the money, literally and figuratively. He's saying, I will not give you my money anymore, company X, company Y,
and
if
so
you don't do these
I would argue that the fiduciary exposure to the board by not doing it is far more.
I 100% agree.
Far greater.
We just need more benevolent dictators like that, or at Intel when they say, we will only do it this way, figure it out, so we can quickly get better at it. Like, have you ever seen Kick the Ladder Out for Honda? The CEO used to get out there on stage in front of the press and he would say, we have a car, it's going to have these performance requirements, it's going to be at this price point. And the VPs in the back were like, we have a car that does that? And they would say, we don't have anything like that. And he said, but we will, because I just told everybody we will have it. So that became the guiding principle, not what we could do, what we couldn't do. He said, we will have this. The benevolent dictators like at BlackRock. We need more of you. Hopefully there are some of you out there that dictate we have to get there.
We're over time, so I'm sorry to cut this off, but we're still here. I think there might be another session after this, which is why I've got a flashing red light in my face. But we're still here and happy to have further conversations about this. This is really an important issue, and we were talking backstage too that PTC really also helps in this industry to contribute in the ESG framework, whether it's through diversity, women, through membership, through the PTC Academy, through different programs. So, you know, it takes a village in a lot of different places to achieve. Sorry.
If I may, Tara, would everyone raise your hand if you are a member of PTC? A member. Who's a member? First off, thank you. Thank you for your membership, and know that it goes towards social responsibility, not just for PTC, but also for you as an individual and the company you represent. For those who didn't raise your hands, we, the three of us, encourage you, please consider membership. Membership is, this conference is amazing. It gives us the opportunity to innovate together and collaborate towards that mission of improving lives in the Asia-Pac area. So.
An easy way to put your money where your mouth is today. Join.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tara.
Help me thank my panel.
Fantastic. Super fun.
Thank you.